Welcome back, Belmont brothers and sisters. This is session 2, listening to the life of Jesus, learning to listen to the details and what the gospel writers were interested in, and sometimes what they weren't interested in. And we're going to begin with Mark. We believe that Mark was the first gospel to be written. Probably around 64, 65 AD. We're going to look at the life situation in just a second. But remember, we listen to the author's voice in the life situation. We listen to what they don't say. We listen to the structure of the gospel, and we're going to do that with Mark now. So let's begin with that first question. Who is Mark? Listening to his voice. What's unique about his voice? What's unique about him? And this will help us to understand his gospel and what he has to say about Jesus. What details he chooses to share with us about Jesus. Well, Mark was a remarkable person. We don't appreciate him, I think, as we should. We know from Colossians 4:10, he's the nephew or the cousin, we're not quite sure what that word means, of Barnabas. Come on, Barnabas, one of Paul's companions, one of the first Christian missionaries. So he is a cousin or a nephew of Barnabas, one of the church leaders. We know that he was a disciple of Jesus. He lived in Jerusalem with his mother Mary, Acts 12:12. When Peter is busted out of prison by an angel, where's the first place he goes? Mark's house. I mean, come on, Mark's house. So Mark's home was a place where the early church met in Jerusalem. I would like to think that that's where the Lord's Supper occurred. My academic reason for that is I really want it to be that way. I think it's a really cool idea. Some people believe, I'm not so sure, but anyway, some people believe there's a little cameo of Mark in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 14, verses 51 and 52. And that's where in the garden, when Jesus is arrested, a young man is there, and he has a linen sheet wrapped around him, and the Roman soldiers grab the sheet, and he spins away and runs away naked. Some people believe that's a little cameo of Mark. Don't know. Interesting idea. We do know from Acts 11 that he travels with Barnabas and Paul. So not only is he Barnabas' cousin, not only was he there during the ministry of Jesus and the disciples are coming and going from his house, but he travels with Paul and Barnabas. So he comes under the influence of Paul. And Paul acknowledges Mark and speaks very highly of him, Colossians 4:10 and 2 Timothy 4:11. So cousin of Barnabas, disciple of Jesus, a disciple of Paul. He works with Paul in Rome, but the most important thing, the most important person in Mark's life is Peter. He is a very close disciple, close follower of Peter. In fact, in 1 Peter 5:13, listen to how Peter closes his letter. She was in Babylon, and that's a code word for Rome. She was in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, as does Mark, my son. Peter refers to Mark as his son, which means they are very close. Some people believe that Peter was actually responsible for leading Mark to faith in Jesus. So this becomes important when we start reading the gospel, because in many ways the gospel of Mark is the gospel of Peter. Peter says in a very interesting passage in 2 Peter 1:15, I'll just read it really quickly because it's right here. 2 Peter 1:15, Peter says, "And I will also make every effort so that you are able to recall these things at any time after my departure." 2 Peter, he knows he's dying. He knows he's going to die in 2 Peter. And I've done everything possible to make sure that you could remember these things. A lot of scholars believe Peter is referring to the fact that he is spending time with Mark the early church came to Peter in Rome and said, please write down your experiences with Jesus. We read this in Eusebius, the first collector of church histories. Please write down your remembrances of being with Jesus. And we believe, and Eusebius believed, that Mark was the person who actually wrote down Peter's account. And so what would you expect? What would you expect from hearing Peter telling about Jesus? And it makes up a lot of the uniquenesses of Mark. First of all, you have examples like in 6:45 when Jesus walks on the water. You read that account. Now we know from Matthew that someone else walked on the water, correct? Peter walked on the water. Look at it in Mark 6:45. There's no reference whatsoever of Peter. He leaves himself out of that story. And I think that's indicative of his humility, who he eventually became as a person. How about in Mark 8:31 when Peter makes his great confession? We read that in the other Gospels, and Jesus first blesses Peter. Blessed art you. Man didn't show that to you. God showed that to you. Read it in Mark 8:31. The blessing is there. The curse is there. But Peter leaves the blessing out. He consistently leaves himself out of the story. So when we're listening to the voice of Mark, in many ways we're listening to the voice of Peter. And that makes Mark especially significant, being the first gospel and being the testimony of Peter. So we'll hear Peter's voice. The disciples are referred to as Peter and his companions, or Peter and those with him. So when you're listening to Mark this week, listen for that. The life situation of Mark really helps us understand the uniqueness of the gospel as well. We are fairly certain as we can be of the life situations of the Gospels, we are fairly certain that Mark is written right after the Great Fire in Rome. Now we know in July 18th, 64 AD, a fire broke out in Rome. 11 of the 14 districts burned to the ground. Now Rome had burned other times, but this was a particularly horrific fire. 11 of the 14 districts are destroyed. And when the fire's out and things sort of begin to calm down, people start talking to each other and they realize that Nero had set that fire. He was building an enormous palace for himself right in the center of Rome. There's a hallway in this palace that's a third of a mile long. It was referred to as the Golden Palace. And he wanted to clear out part of the slums in the city, and the belief was that he set a fire. And Suetonius, one of the early church historians, tells us, Tacitus and Suetonius both give us the accounts of the fire in Rome. We're told that Nero realizes he needs to come up with a scapegoat. He needs to come up with someone to blame for the fire. And he decides, I'm going to blame the Christians. Everyone hates them anyway. And so the very first persecution against the church begins after the fire in 64 AD in Rome. And that's a very important date for any Christian to know. We need to know 64 AD and the fire in Rome. And you see this reflected in the Gospels. So again, when you're listening to Mark, you hear things, and I think I referred to this before, in 1:13, when Mark talks about Jesus in the wilderness, the temptation in the wilderness. Mark is not particularly interested in that story. He doesn't give us the threefold temptation that the other Gospels give us, but he gives us one detail in verse 13 that none of the other Gospels give us, and that is that when Jesus was in the wilderness, he was with the wild beasts, and we believe that's because Mark is writing to people who are suffering persecution after the fire in Rome, some of whom are being thrown to wild beasts in the arena. Only Mark tells us of Jesus' parents, his mother and brothers, thinking that he's out of his mind. That's in 3:21. And we believe that that's connected to the fire in Rome and to the first readers of Mark's gospel, whose relatives and the people close to them are saying, you must be out of your mind. Mark wants you to know you're not going to suffer anything that Jesus hasn't already suffered. Okay, if you're with the wild beasts in the arena, Jesus was with the wild beasts in the wilderness. Your family thinks you're out of your mind. Jesus' family thought he was out of his mind. In 321, in 417, Jesus makes the statement that some people will fall away when persecution comes because of the word. Only Mark tells us about that. In 9:49, Jesus says that everyone will be salted with fire. That is only in Mark. And a lot of us believe that that's a reference to this horrible fire in Rome. In 10:30, Jesus promises that those who follow him will that they will be returned 100-fold with persecution, and that with persecution is only in Mark. And there's several other. Actually, there's too many examples to show right here. But when you're listening to Mark, listen for these things. Listen for the immediacy of Jesus' language. Jesus does not talk much in the Gospel of Mark. If you time it, I actually timed it once, he speaks for 22 minutes. That's all. In Matthew, he speaks for almost 2 hours, or hour and a half. So in Mark, the immediacy of Jesus' language, he only speaks 22 minutes. Notice that Mark, I describe it this way, there's an absence of what I call a secondary agenda. Luke wants to show us that everyone was amazed by Jesus. I call it the gospel of amazement. Matthew wants to talk about the kingdom. That's a major theme. John wants to show that Jesus is the wisdom of God. I don't think we have that kind of a secondary agenda in Mark because it's so primitive. So there's an absence of a secondary agenda. And of course the main agenda is to tell us who Jesus is. Really fascinating to me in the Gospel of Mark, as primitive as it is, it shows us the emotional life of Jesus. Far more, if you count them, far more adjectives in Mark describing Jesus' emotion. And we're going to look at a passage, one of those passages in just a minute. Jesus is very emotional. He gets madder in Mark. He seems to feel more compassion. You read Jesus in the Gospel of John, he's fairly unemotional. But Mark gives us the emotional life of Jesus. In Mark, we hear Jesus' literal voice. That is, we have these Aramaic little fragments, Talitha cum, that sort of thing. So we get to hear, in one sense, Jesus' literal voice, lama sabachthani, that sort of thing. The prospect of suffering is always there in Mark. And again, that connects us to the first readers, the Roman Christians who are suffering persecution after the fire. And one thing that double check me on this when you read through Mark and see if you see this as well. But what I see in Mark is a focus on the fact that Jesus' ministry, in one sense, is sort of out of control. And one of the ways you see that is how frequently Jesus will do a miracle, and he'll tell the person that's been healed, please don't tell anybody I did that. The scholars call it the messianic secret, and there's this not so bright idea that Jesus is somehow keeping his messiahship a secret. I don't think that's true at all. I think he's trying to keep a lid on things. And what's interesting, in Mark, he'll tell someone, please don't tell. They almost never obey. They always tell. How can you not tell? And what happens is, in the next few verses, Jesus will be covered up with people who want a free meal, who want to be healed, and they're not interested in hearing what he's come to say, the good news of the kingdom. So in one sense, in the Gospel of Mark, we have what I call a ministry that's out of control. Let's look at one passage that illustrates a lot of these things I'm talking about. This is for the first chapter the healing of the leper in Mark 1, verse 40. Now this is one of the 4 messianic miracles. Remember, the rabbi said there's only 4 things, only 4 miracles that the Messiah can do. Let's see if I can remember them. The first one is healing a leper, and it was regarded by many people as a more miraculous healing than raising someone from the dead, because leprosy was seen as sort of a living death. So to heal a leper, and in some people's minds, was a bigger deal than raising someone from the dead. So healing a leper, casting out a mute demon, a demon who was mute, raising someone from the dead, and I never can remember the 4th one. I'll think of it in a minute. So let's look at this. Let's look at this sweet man who has leprosy, a living death. Living death. All of the descriptions and the legalities of leprosy are in Leviticus 13. If you want to look and see the kind of the Old Testament context. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Okay? This is so Markan. Verse 41, filled with compassion. That's Markan language. There's the emotional life of Jesus. He's filled with compassion. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. Now we know you're not supposed to touch lepers, because if you do, you become unclean. It's like the flow from their leprosy goes up your arm and makes you unclean. Only Jesus has reversed that flow, and when he touches lepers, being clean comes from him and flows out to them. So Jesus touches the man, and he says, "I am willing." He said, "Be clean." The miracles of Jesus through all the Gospels, this isn't unique to Mark, the miracles of Jesus have an unmiraculous character to them. By that, I'm not saying that he doesn't do incredible miracles. He does incredible things. Raising someone from the dead is, not too shabby. But the way he performs his miracles is very unmiraculous. There's no lightning bolts from his fingertips. There's no, be healed. None of that business. Jesus will simply speak the word of healing. Sometimes he's not even there. Go home. Your servant is well. He heals in absentia. When he heals when he feeds the 5,000 and the 4,000, he simply says the blessing. Again, there's no drawing attention to himself, which Jesus also does not do. He always points away from himself, and he always wins praise for the Father. And you'll notice these unmiraculous miracles happen, and no one praises Jesus. They always praise God. Jesus wins praise for the Father by the way he does miracles. And we're going to see this in all the Gospels. There's only one exception, and it's in Mark, when the disciples are on the storm in the Sea of Galilee and Jesus calms the storm. The disciples worship him after that. That's the one time he receives worship for doing a miracle. Otherwise, he wins praise and wins worship for God. So Jesus is filled with compassion. There's the emotion of Jesus. And this word is a special word. It's a word from Old Classical Greek. It's basically untranslatable. Sometimes it's translated pity, being moved. It's a hard word to translate. But it originally referred to a horse snorting. And by that, I like the word shudder. So Jesus was filled with compassion. Jesus shuddered. He's so moved by this moment that he reaches out and touches the man. I'm willing, he says, be clean immediately, which is Mark's favorite word, euthos. He loves that word. Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. And here's the emotional Jesus. Jesus sent, that's NIV. A better word is drove. His emotions change from this compassion to not quite anger, but he becomes very intense. He drives him away at once with a strong warning. See that you don't tell this to anyone. Now, don't miss the significance of this moment. He's filled with compassion. This poor man, living death. He can't be part of the community, right? Jesus touches him. He heals him. And then he realizes what this is going to mean. He's going to be so covered up with people who just want healing, who just want miracles. And so he gives him a stern warning, and he drives him away, and he says, see that you don't tell this to anyone. This is this messianic secret business that we find so much in Mark. But go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded you for your cleansing as a testimony to them. That's Leviticus 14. And one of the things I think we miss in looking at the life of Jesus is how much of an orthodox traditionalist he really was. You know, he'll be engaged with the Pharisees, and he'll say, what does Moses say? And here, after this healing, he's go do what Leviticus 14 tells you to do. Sometimes he's seen as sort of this radical firebrand who's breaking away from Judaism. That's not true at all. The Pharisees are the ones that are breaking away from Judaism. They're the ones that are adding new laws, inventing the oral tradition that Jesus says really goes against the law of Moses, at least sometimes. So here he's very traditional. Go show yourself to the priests. The priests have to inspect you over a certain period of time. There's a place in the temple where you stay while you're being inspected. And then they pronounce that you are clean. And then you offer sacrifices as a testimony to them. Okay? Now Jesus was worried, right? Don't tell anybody. And this is what always happens. Look what happens in 45. Instead, he went out and began to talk freely. See that you tell this to no one. Instead, he goes out and begins to talk freely. How can you not tell? Right? How can you not tell? Spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in Eremos, wilderness places, lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. That is the ending of chapter 1 in Mark. So by the end of chapter 1, by the end of the first chapter, the ministry is out of control. He knows what it's going to how it's going to impact his ministry when he heals this man. Maybe that's part of the business of him shuddering, or certainly it's part of him driving him away and telling him not to tell anybody. He knows it's going to have a negative impact on his ministry because he's covered up with people who want miracles, who don't want to hear what he has to say. Yet he does it anyway, because that shows us the heart of Jesus. Even though it may potentially work against him, he is not going to leave this man in his leprosy. He is going to touch him and heal him. So that's one of the uniquenesses of the Gospel of Mark that comes right out of chapter 1. We will go on next week to look at Luke and then Matthew. They were written right around the same time. And then finally we'll look at John. And once again, as you read through Matthew, look for the immediacy of the language of Jesus. Look for this emotionality of Jesus. Look at how the prospect of suffering is almost always there, because he's writing to people who are suffering. And listen for the voice of Peter. The Gospel of Mark is really the Gospel of Peter. And I will see you again next week.